afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I'm delighted to introduce you now to our penultimate session of today's agenda, titled Innovation in Regulation, What Developers and Investors Need to Know. Please do ask your questions and make your comments in the chat and Q&A sections to the right of the video here, and our speakers will be delighted to answer any questions live or indeed in follow-up through those functions on the right-hand side of the video. But for now, delighted to hand you over to our moderator for this discussion, Laurie Alsup. Laurie, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Josh, and welcome everyone. So today we are talking about innovation in regulation, what developers and investors need to know. A pretty big topic, lots of angles to it, lots of prongs, whether we're talking about the impact of evolving patient care, the evolution of guidances or lack of guidances or lack of precedent, how to handle various expedited pathways in the US and Europe, how to sort through global input. We'll try our best to cover some of these things and make sure that we address them in the best way possible. But please, if you have additional questions, as Josh said, please pass them along. So there are many factors, but today we are really very fortunate to have two amazing leaders in the biotechnology industry who have contributed to the development and the approval of many successful products over the years, but from very different vantage points. And I think you'll hear the different vantage points as we talk. So joining me today, we have Dr. Steffen Thirstrup, who is a former member of the CHMP of the European Medicines Agency and a regulatory advisor with NDA Group, and Dr. Ed Kaye, CEO of Stoke Therapeutics, a Massachusetts-based company focused on severe and progressive genetic form of epilepsy. So welcome both of you. And I think before we start with our discussion, I think it'd be helpful if you would elaborate a little bit on your background so the audience understands where you're coming from as you share some of your perspectives. So we'll start with you, Ed.
Thanks, Laurie. Yes, my name is Edward Kaye, and I'm CEO here at Stoke Therapeutics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My background is probably a little unusual, I think, for the biotech industry. I spent a number of years in academia where I was a practicing pediatric neurologist and biochemical geneticist. And for me, I really elected to go into the biotech industry when it became clear that we were ready for genetic therapies in really rare and genetic diseases that were affecting children. And so I had my first opportunity at Genzyme, and I was able to run the clinical development programs for the lysosomal and the genetic diseases. So at Genzyme, I had really 5 drugs that were approved when I led those programs, and that was a great experience. I had been there for 10 years. And then I had the opportunity to be Chief Medical Officer and CEO at Therapeutics. And again, that was really a breakthrough therapy from that perspective in regards to really the first drug using exon skipping for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So I think I've had an opportunity both as a treating physician and then as an executive at a biotech company to kind of observe this process over the last really, over really 30 years.
Great, thank you, Ed. And Steffen, please please share and elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Laurie, and thank you for inviting me here. Like Ed, I also come into this by a little bit convoluted way. I'm a medic and actually thought I should be a respiratory physician, starting out doing a PhD in isolated organs and moving into clinical practice, where I spent 10 years in internal medicine and pulmonary medicines in particular. When I then joined the Danish agency to start reviewing, in the first case, medicinal product for respiratory diseases, but it soon evolved into a full-time commitment there as a member of CHMP at the European agency, and for that being rapporteur for numerous of products, both small molecules, but in particular some biologicals as well, of major therapeutic interest. I ended up being the head of the licensing division in the Danish agency before I, 8 years ago, joined NDA as a consultant and teaming up a group of senior ex-regulators like myself. So I have not really worked in industry, but I worked on the other side of the table and been involved in helping companies develop their products and getting them to the market.
Super. Thank you so much, Steffen and Ed. So let's move into at least some of these topics that relate to our main focus today. So from an internal perspective and sort of inside the industry, there's always a tension of time and cost. And particularly when you were talking about diseases of high unmet medical need, where indeed there's an urgency for getting these products out to patients. So maybe we can talk a little bit, starting with you, Ed, about how you consider drug development under these rather stressful conditions, and maybe some issues you've faced and other thoughts about how to approach some of these stresses around time and cost.
Yeah, I think that is always a natural tension that occurs. And I think the way I look at it, I have, they always say, isn't it great to be a CEO where you're the boss? And I think what you realize as soon as you become a CEO is that you are no longer the boss, but you have other people who are above you. And I think certainly in the biotech industry, the way I look at it is really the three groups that I really need to address. I think number one is the patients, and no one has the urgency to have a therapy than some patient population that has no treatment available, and there's always that urgency. But then again, you have to address your board of directors and make sure that you have a plan, and you have to explain why you're spending money on a particular program. And then of course the investors, they have to believe that you will be able to get this approved, and they'll get a reasonable return on their investment within a reasonable period of time. So that's always the conflict. But I think what I always try to remind people, it's not really just when you get the drug approved that you're at the end of the road. It is the most important aspect is you actually have to get it out to the patients. And the only way that you can get it out to the patients is it has to be reimbursed. And whether it's in the United States where you have third-party payers, but certainly in the European countries and other regions of the world, you have a national health agency that you have to listen to. And so I think one of the challenges, and I think we've all struggled with this, is you have to get it registered in the country, but then you have to get it paid for. And sometimes there is this dichotomy between what is expected from a regulatory perspective to get it registered, and then you actually have to show a benefit to patients to really explain, why they should pay that much money, especially if it's for a rare disease where typically the cost for development is higher and then the price is higher because you have a small number of patients. So they're equally as important. And to me, the goal is, how do I get this particular therapy to patients as quickly as possible? And sometimes it's not always as straightforward, and you have to always be thoughtful of what the end game is and how do I actually do that. And sometimes you can have a very expedited registration approval, but then you can't get it paid for. And then to me, that you haven't helped anyone because no one is actually using your drug. So it doesn't matter that it's approved. The important thing is, can patients benefit from the therapy that you're developing?
Yeah, Ed, I think that's well said. So I'm going to turn to you, Steffen, from your experience and perspective. How do you look at this dichotomy of what it takes to get a product approved from a regulatory perspective, and what it takes to get a product really used and reimbursed and paid for by authorities or by third-party payers or in whichever jurisdiction?
Yeah. It is definitely a challenge, and I share Ed's view that of course the ultimate is to get the product to the patients. And I actually have experienced myself as a regulator. You've been trying to understand the benefit of the drug and assess the data and granting a marketing authorization, and then you get the you can see that patients actually not getting access to the product because it runs into discussions about pricing and reimbursement. That's not satisfying at any way. On the other hand, coming from the regulatory world and having been working in an agency where we actually also had a part that took care of pricing and reimbursement, although for primary care products. But you know, the data are, I sometimes get the question, how can the same set of data lead to two different conclusions? The one being we can improve the product, the other one we are not willing to pay for it. And I think it's important to realize that the two bodies are looking at the same set of data with two different pair of glasses, if I may use that analogy. You know, the regulators look at benefit risk. Does this product and do the data support that the benefits outweighs the risk? And if the answer is yes, and of course an important part that plays into this is the unmet medical need, the severity of the condition and so forth, then the product can be licensed. Then it's, from a public perspective, safe to give to patients. Whereas the payers, they are more or less, you know, guarding the money. So they are sitting on the money, and they are, at least in Europe, where you in many countries have a taxpayer financed healthcare system, they are asking the question, does this product actually provide more healthcare for our money? So it's more a matter of prioritizing the money. So if we spend a lot of money on X new product, then we cannot spend those money on something else. So it's also this, you know, going into the question, how do we how do we utilize our resources best possible? And that's why looking at the same set of data may lead to different conclusions.
So just while we're on this topic, how would you advise companies, particularly young companies who may not have a lot of experience, to gain this insight before they embark on a development pathway to actually meet, as much as possible, both lenses here from a regulatory and a payer's perspective? Is there anything that they could be doing from the get-go? I'll start with you, Steffen.
Yeah, you more or less gave the answer yourself, because it's a matter of engaging early. All companies are used to engage with regulators and get a scientific advice, or start up having kickoff meetings with the FDA, or whether they start their development. And already when they start that, they start discussing the endpoints that can satisfy regulators' benefit risk concern. But there's actually the opportunity to talk to payers as well and try to understand what are they looking for, because sometimes they are looking for another set of endpoint, or maybe another kind of trial to answer the questions. I know some big companies, the commercial part and the medical part don't speak. In other cases, companies know that the answer from payers will be that they are going to do a head-to-head comparison with some other product, which they don't like to do, and therefore they don't ask, because they don't like to hear the answer, even though they know the answer. And if they don't have the data, they will have troubles in the end. So early engagement, and maybe try to convince, if you can, what you would like to do and what is feasible to do, and also what is ethical to do in the patient population.
Yeah, Ed, any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, actually, I think sometimes we probably even take it further. Before we decide to go into a particular disease, we will have discussions with third-party payers. We've done it with countries and with different insurance companies in the United States. And the question is, you know, if our drug, and we have in our mind what the target product profile, what it should do. And we will ask them, if we can achieve X, Y, or Z, is this something that you would be willing to reimburse? And so we actually do that before we even choose to go into that disease. We have an idea that this is what we're going to need to do, and this is what the criterion for approval and pay and to get paid for your product. And some of that, of course, is, and we also do the same with the patients and the physicians. And one of the things sometimes that companies forget is what's important. What do you have to fix for the patients to feel like they're really going to get a benefit from it. And that is, and it often is different than what the physicians think. So a good example that we had with our program in Dravet syndrome, which is a relatively common genetic form of intractable epilepsy. The physicians, who are pediatric epileptologists, said their primary concern was controlling the seizures. When we actually talked to the patients, to the families, their primary concern was this progressive developmental delay. That was much more disturbing for the families. And so we knew that if we were really going to have a successful product and medicine for these people, we would have to have something that addresses not only the seizures, but the other comorbidities, the neurologic problems that are associated. And we thought we could probably do this by directly addressing the underlying genetic cause of the disease. And that not only hopefully would affect the seizures, which we knew from animals it probably would, but we were fairly confident that we should have some other effect on the cognitive effects of the particular disease. So I think it really starts very, very early. And I think, in the biotech world, in the pharmaceutical world, we talk about the target product profile. And you have to know, how good does this drug have to be, and what do I have to address to really have a therapy that patients want? And if patients want it and it really improves their lives, then typically the payers will see the benefit in it. And so it comes back to this teamwork. I mean, I think there is this triad. You have to address the patient's needs, you have to address obviously the company's needs, and then the regulatory and the payers. And everybody has to kind of agree at the outset, define what a success is. And if you reach it, then it shouldn't be a problem. Now, sometimes defining success is not so easy. What success is in terms of for the biotech company may be different than for the regulatory agencies, and sometimes the patients have a lower threshold. They're looking for any kind of help, but you have to come to some agreement on what success is. And if you can achieve that success, then hopefully you'll get your drug registered and paid for.
That's great, Ed. Go ahead, Steffen.
Yeah, I agree very much to what Ed said, and you said something about patients, which I find very important, because many biotech companies who endeavor into areas where there is no therapy, therefore there's no regulatory precedence, there are no regulatory guidance there. There is a need to develop new endpoints, and you're perfectly right. One thing is sometimes the endpoint that regulators and perhaps physicians would like to see, which sometimes are what we could call very hard endpoints, and then we disregard what actually matters for patients. I have worked with regulators, not worked with, but seen regulators say that 6-minute walking test is the preferred endpoint in muscular dystrophy. But if you come to some of those wheelchair-bound boys, 6-minute walking test doesn't matter any longer, but something else matters for them. That may be getting their hands to the keyboard for their computer. So therefore, there is a need, first of all, to work with patients to develop good endpoints and validate them. And then, as Ed said, go into the discussion with regulators and payers, actually to be able to say, this is an endpoint that matters for patients. So patient-reported outcomes, or whatever we should call them, but also actually the need to develop new endpoints and get them validated. If you are in the forefront of science, which many biotech companies are, is equally important.
Yeah. So the example I think that we had when I was at Sarepta is, obviously we were trying to develop the first drug for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. You're right, the 6-minute walk test was the preferred endpoint, which the regulatory authorities had been familiar with. And it was interesting is that it was also the endpoint that we had used in Pompe disease when I was at Genzyme. And that was not an endpoint that we wanted to use at all, because we knew it was going to be challenging and it wasn't necessarily going to give us the information that we needed, but that was what we were required to do. And when we were working with patients with Duchenne, I remember the mothers who never underestimate the power of observation of the primary caretaker. And in this case, it was the mothers who were noticing the improvement in boys. And one of the things they said is that they asked to have an appointment with us, and they talked to the company, and they said, look, you're not measuring the right things. They go, that's nice, 6-minute walk test, but so what? It's not important to us. And, and so they came out and they had things that were important to them. And one of, it was, if you have a 13-year-old boy and he no longer needs his mother to help with toileting, that's a big improvement in that person's life. If the child doesn't need help getting in and out of the car, that's important for their self-esteem, but it's also much easier for the family. And these were the little things that we neglected to account for. And one of the things that the families did is they literally used their cell phones, took videos, and were able to capture some of the improvements in activities of daily living. And that's what they cared about. They didn't really care. If you were in a wheelchair and you could bring a glass up to your mouth and no one had to help you to feed yourself or to drink from a glass, that was an enormous improvement. And that's something that we hadn't considered. And so these are some of the lessons I think and it gets down to asking the families and asking the patients, what's important to you? And if you can do that, then that should be valuable.
That's great, Ed. Yeah, and you both went right to the importance of patients and patient input and caregivers in product development. And this has been a major, actually, regulatory innovation. And FDA welcomes this, EMA welcomes this, and it is very important, particularly in these diseases that are very difficult and rare. But I'm going to come back to the whole thought process around regulatory input and early regulatory input, and at least from a shareholder perspective, the board, investors, people want to know that you've spoken to the FDA. People want to know that you've had good discussions. People want to know that you're getting input. But often the input across these jurisdictions differ, and they still differ today. Despite harmonization, despite collaboration, so on. So maybe both of you and Steffen, I'll start with you. How do you think about, in a global program, I'm going to use the word reconciling input across FDA, EMA, Japan, China, anywhere else that we want to get our products approved and get them to patients from the approvability perspective? And I think that's something that we all still struggle with, and it still takes a considerable amount of time and effort to figure out how to do that and how not to end up with costly development programs to serve multiple masters. So maybe we can start with you, Steffen, and then I'll go to you, Ed.
Yeah. Thank you, Laurie. I must start out saying I don't have the magic bullet here, so I'm going to disappoint you a bit, of course. But anyway, I think, as you said, there are increasing collaborations and increasing crosstalk. There will still, and I don't think we will ever get rid of differences across regions, because some of those differences also comes down to therapeutic tradition, the differences in how healthcare systems are built and so forth. Mm-hmm. But of course, the more what you can do as a sponsor here is to engage early. I think we all agree on that. Secondly, I think you need to engage early more than one place. So starting off early with FDA, as many companies do, yes, that's good. But if you get too far down the road with FDA and doesn't catch up with the European agency or Japan or whatever your primary targets are, you don't get the chance to go into a reconciliation process between the agencies, because you need to be the middleman. Of course, these companies are talking to each other behind the scenes, especially if you have some very interesting products. Of course, you can apply for joint FDA EMA advices. It's a process that's been around for years. It's rather cumbersome. There are time slots that needs to be fitted together. But if you take on the responsibility to be the middleman here and drive the negotiations, so I think the best advice for me is First of all, start early and start with more than one set of regulators and work on getting alignment and agreement as much as you can, but don't expect to get it completely agreed, especially in the more challenging areas and on the forefront of science.
Yeah. Ed, do you have
Yeah,
any
yeah,
thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I think it is a challenging problem, and I think there isn't an easy solution. I've tried personally to have the joint programs, but those are very lengthy to schedule, and sometimes you do not have the luxury of time to be able to do that. But I think what I've learned, and a very good lesson, is if you simply, for example, just go in Europe or in the US and you go down that path, and then a year later or a year and a half later, you decide to interact with the second agency, there could be very different approaches. And sometimes the worst outcome is you have to have two different kind of trials. And no company wants to do that because it reduces the power and the numbers, especially if you're in a rare disease. What I think what we found is that you really do need to have those discussions. And what I found is typically at the end, someone will say is, well, what did the EMA say? Or what did the FDA say? And so even though it's not a primary concern, they are interested in what the other agencies think. And again, you have the ability of, and we've said this, well, that may not be possible in other jurisdictions, and they know what we mean. And so then you try to come to a compromise and figure out something. And sometimes it's a matter of having an extra endpoint that one agency really wants to see, that you wouldn't necessarily have included, but it really is going to be critical. The other thing I think, Stefan brought about, I think Japan and China, I think the critical features, at least in my experience, is making sure that you have sites in those regions. Because otherwise what you end up having to do is a confirmatory study, sometimes we refer to it as a bridging study, having the same endpoints and do it in the country. But if you incorporate them in your pivotal study, both in China, and China is becoming much more important than it used to be. I think that is a way, again, of getting different regions involved early, and it really does expedite your approval process when you're already in the country, and you have key opinion leaders who then the regulatory authorities can actually ask questions to because they've used your product, they've used your medicine, and those are really the unbiased experts that you want to be able to help support you.
Yeah, that's great, Ed. So a nuance of agency feedback is the role of various expedited pathways and what I'll call innovation designations that, of course, companies, and we get asked all the time, how do I get breakthrough? How do I get RMAT? When do I ask for Fasttrack? And obviously there's, tremendous interest in what this can do to your development cycle time and your value proposition for your product. So maybe we can sort of parse this both from a US and European perspective a little bit and get your points of view of these various pathways and designations. When should they be considered? And what are the pros and cons around it? So Ed, maybe we'll start with you on the US side, whether it's a breakthrough or fast track or accelerated approval. Maybe you could help sift through this.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to, I think, what Stefan had talked about before. It's really about having that dialogue with the agency. I think, certainly the fast track designation is probably the most concrete, because what that does is it's accelerating the review process. Typically in the US, it's about a 10 to 12 month time period. It will vary depending on the division who's reviewing it. But if you have fast track designation, and primarily you need that if it's an unmet need that there is no other therapies that are available. So that means that they will, put you in the fast track, and they will be able to do that. I think that certainly is pretty straightforward, and either you'll get it or not, and you probably will know based on what the competition is for your product. So that's something I think that is straightforward. The accelerated approval is a little bit more challenging, because that, in other words, can be accelerated approval based on a biomarker that would be validated. So some are pretty straightforward. So for instance, in cystic fibrosis, if you can restore the chloride levels in sweat, that's a really strong biomarker that you're going to have an effect, and that correlates pretty well with your pulmonary function, the FEV1. But some are a little bit more obtuse and not always so straightforward. And you could get an accelerated approval, but then you also may have to have basically a follow-on studies, say in a phase 4, where you have a clinical biomarker that confirms what you found with the accelerated approval. So that's not always so easy to do, and that also can be a challenge in regards to getting the product reimbursed. The other one that everyone likes to talk about is where you have the discussion based on your phase 2 clinical data. That's a breakthrough therapy. But that means that you have to wait all the way until you have clinical data typically in a phase 2, and then you have those discussions. In my experience, if you have an unmet need and there's no therapy, if you have really good clinical data, the FDA is going to bend over backwards to help you, because they want it approved almost as much as you do, because they understand the need for the patients. So breakthrough therapy has gotten a lot of press. I think it's great for investors. They'd love to see it. I'm not sure how much of a breakthrough it is, because by that point, you pretty much know the drug is going to work. And usually you could have those discussions with the agency to try to get it through. So that's the one that's been, I think, a little hyped up. And I think you shouldn't wait until you have phase 2 data when you're having discussions with the FDA. That really needs to start at a very early stage when you're filing your IND, your investigational new drug application, and really talk about what you're trying to achieve.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Ed. Steffen, can you share with us from the European perspective?
Well, the European system, again, it's, as Ed said, it's focused on shortening the review time. So it has not so much to do with speeding up the development process all over. It's actually a matter of cutting down on the very last part of getting to the patient, which of course is important, because that's when you hopefully have the data that can support an approval. What we see most of in Europe is what is called conditional approval. So that's equivalent to the accelerated pathway in US, where you come in with biomarker data. Potentially, it could be phase 2 data that are not completely mature, but they need to be sufficiently strong enough to say that, well, there's an unmet medical need. That's the basis, of course, and the benefit risk is considered positive based on the data you have there. Then you can get a conditional approval, and the condition being that you will be able to provide further confirmatory data, either in the setting you're studying or potentially in an earlier setting. If we're talking oncology, that could be it. That's the most frequent used expedited pathway in Europe. Then there's the accelerated assessment, which is something you can ask for more or less on the same day when you submit your application. And that's a little bit complicated in the sense that then your rapporteurs will have a look at your data, but they cannot do the deep dive because that does time not allow for. But if your data and not only your data, but your application in full looks convincing and comprehensive, they can consider shortening down the review time from the normal 210 days to 150. But with the caveat, if there are outstanding issues after 150 days, you revert the timetable to the normal 210. And many ends up in either getting a no because it's difficult to judge the robustness and comprehensiveness up front without having doing the deep dive into data, which time does not allow. And secondly, when they go into the accelerated assessment, they end up having outstanding issues and then they end in the normal timetable. It's used, companies are very keen on getting it. I would say for many, it's a big effort that may not pay off in the end. Whereas the conditional approval is something that may pay off, and you can actually consider doing your development program to target a conditional approval, and you can go for a scientific advice with the CHMP to discuss how to have a development plan that could target a conditional approval. So that would be my recommendation. Yep. There are a few others, fast tracks in Europe, which I think is out of the question to discuss here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Steffen. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to turn the page to what I'll call crystal ball time. So we've just been through the most horrendous and horrific 2020. The pandemic has had impact on every aspect of our industry and patient care. But we've also seen some interesting innovation at the regulatory front among companies, collaboration that was unprecedented, collaboration across agencies, and completely different ways of working. Remote meetings, remote data monitoring for patients, remote therapeutic interventions. So maybe we can start with you, Steffen. How would you hope or expect to continue to see further innovation in regulatory processes, collaboration across agencies, to just free up the busy work, let's say, and get on with it and really learn from the COVID experience, things that we can take away positively that we might be able to put into practice. So Steffen, let's start with you.
Well, I think one of the things that I'm pretty sure will happen is that there's going to be a discussion in Europe about using the rolling review, because otherwise Europe has been very locked to time slots. I don't foresee that everything will end in rolling review, because I also know from my contacts in the agency that this has been very stressful, and especially the review of the COVID-19 vaccines, where of course there also is a huge public pressure on getting those vaccines approved, and political pressure, not to forget. But I could foresee that in a revision of the legislation, that some of those products that are considered for very high unmet medical need, debilitating, life-threatening conditions, that there could be an option for a kind of rolling review that would mean that companies can come with their data drip-wise and get more or less the checkboxes checked off, and then have the final review at the end. So you get a more overlap between development and approval. I think that's been one of the learnings. I think the challenge for the agency is to get this balanced off the impact rolling review has on staff and workload. So finding the right balance there where it ultimately benefits public health. I think that's one learning. We also learned, and that's not only in agencies, but it's in every company, that we can actually do a lot of remote working. We can do Zoom, Skype, team meetings that are almost as efficacious as sitting together. We may even save some travel time where we can use that time in another way. I don't hope that we will get completely away from the face-to-face meetings, because we are still humans, and having that human touch first time you meet people can create some very strong bonds that actually can foster good collaboration also online down the road. But I think we have had some important learnings from this period that can also ultimately benefit patients in terms of getting quick access.
Great, thank you, Steffen. I'll turn to you, Ed, in the last minute or so. Your crystal ball, how do you see learnings from the COVID experience as it relates to regulatory collaboration and speed and improve processes.
Yeah, I think, probably the most important lesson is that if it's an important enough of a problem, we can expedite it. And I think, what we saw with Pfizer and BioNTech and with Moderna, a whole new class of medicine was able to be approved, in many different jurisdictions throughout the world was very impressive. I think the other thing that we learned, in addition to the dealings with the regulatory authorities, I think certainly in the US and in Europe, the agencies have been much more willing to accept data that is monitored remotely. And so that was actually allowed trials to continue, because if you couldn't get to a site because it was closed down, you had to figure out how to do remote monitoring. So I think that is one thing that will remain. And I think what we found out from remote monitoring is, in fact, it's pretty good data. You don't necessarily have to have a person in the hospital, but if you have the ability to review this data and to set up things, and that also means for patients, so they can be interviewed by the physician via Zoom if they can't come to the hospital. So if we can make trials easier for patients and expedite that, and it also reduces the cost significantly, I think that was a really good lesson learned. And I think there's always been a hesitancy on the part of the regulatory agencies if they weren't there in person. But I think now we've gotten more comfortable, and we realize that you can do a lot of things remotely. It doesn't all have to be done in person.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you, Ed. And I think thanks to you both for sharing your insights and experience on these important topics. And I will now turn it back over to our host, Josh. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much to both Steffen and Ed and to Laurie for guiding us through that session. Lots of great insights there, I think. Yeah, please do continue the conversation in the Q&A and chat functions. And yeah, reach out to them if you have any further questions. And indeed, visit the NDA booth with the partners section as well as one of our partners for the Congress. We're back again at 5 o'clock for our final session of today's agenda, presented by Andrei Ostrovsky, former Chief Medical Officer of the US Medicaid Program and Managing Partner with Social Innovation Ventures. The title there, Challenges and Technology Solutions for Dual Eligible Populations in the US. So see you very shortly again. Thanks again to all of our speakers for this session, and see you very soon.